When Richard Montgomery installed the security cameras in his mansion, he had one purpose in mind: to find a reason to fire Ms. Connie. But what those cameras recorded over the next 3 weeks drove Richard to lock himself in his Dubai hotel room and cry for the first time in 2 years. This is a story about surveillance, but not in the way you might think. Richard Montgomery was 58 years old. He owned one of the largest construction companies in New York City, and he was exactly 742 days dry-eyed. That was the exact number. He knew because he'd counted every single day since his daughter's funeral. Melissa, his only daughter, gone at 32 in a car accident while taking the kids to school. The truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. Melissa died instantly. The children survived. At least, physically. If you've ever felt like the world was completely against you, like nothing made sense and like the pain was so big you couldn't even breathe, then maybe, just maybe, you can understand what Richard felt that day, but probably not. Because losing a child is a pain that doesn't have a name, in any language. Brian was 5 years old when he watched his mother die. He was in the back seat. He saw everything: the impact, the glass, the silence that followed. And from that day on, Brian never spoke again. Not a word. Not a sound. The doctors called it severe post-traumatic selective mutism. They said Brian's brain had disconnected from speech as a defense mechanism. He had seen something so terrible that his mind decided words were no longer safe. 2 years after the accident, Brian was 7 years old and still completely silent. Richard had spent over $800,000 on specialists: child psychologists, neurologists, trauma therapists, alternative communication specialists. He took Brian to Boston, to Barcelona, to Tel Aviv. The best professionals in the world examined him. They all said the same thing: he may never speak again. But there was something the doctors didn't know, something no one knew, something that only the security cameras were about to reveal. And that's where Ms. Connie comes in. Connie Silver was 63 years old. She was a black woman with skin as dark as coffee without milk. Her hair was completely white, pulled back in a tight bun. Her body was large, with the natural plumpness of grandmothers who've cooked for entire families for decades. She always wore the same royal blue uniform with a white apron, and she had the softest and strongest hands that Brian had ever known. She'd been working in Richard's house for 8 months. She was hired to clean, to cook, and to help with the kids when Richard traveled. And Richard traveled a lot, too much. 70% of his time was spent out of the house, closing deals, supervising construction sites, running from the emptiness that Melissa's death had left behind. But there was a problem. Richard's new wife, Valerie, didn't trust Ms. Connie. Valerie was 34 years old and blonde, slender, and had been married to Richard for 2 years. She wasn't a bad person, but she wasn't a great stepmother either. She saw Brian and his younger sister, Lily, as constant reminders that Richard had loved another woman before. And she saw Ms. Connie as a threat to her control over the house. One night, 3 weeks before this story changed forever, Valerie said something to Richard that he couldn't shake from his head. The housekeeper, she's doing something weird with Brian. Richard looked up from his phone. Weird? How? I don't know, but every night, when she thinks no one's watching, she goes into Brian's room and closes the door. She stays in there for like an hour, sometimes longer. Richard frowned. Maybe she's just taking care of him. The kid has nightmares. Valerie shook her head. It's not nightmares, Richard. I've seen she does something with him. I don't know what, but I don't like it. Richard didn't want to believe her. Ms. Connie had been impeccable in her work. The house was clean, the food was delicious. The kids seemed comfortable with her, but the seed of doubt was already planted. And Richard Montgomery was a businessman, a man who didn't leave anything to chance, a man who needed proof. 3 days later, while Valerie and the kids were at the park, Richard hired a security company to install hidden cameras, Throughout the house, in the living room, in the kitchen, in the hallways, in the kids' rooms, especially in Brian's room, the cameras were small, invisible, connected to an app on Richard's phone. He could see everything in real time from anywhere in the world, and that's exactly what he was going to do. The next day, Richard took a flight to Dubai. He had an important meeting with Arab investors. He was going to be gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which he was going to watch Ms. Carney's every move. If this story is touching you in any way, if you feel something here resonates with you, I want you to know that what's coming is going to change the way you see the people who work in silence, without expecting recognition, without asking for anything in return. The first night in Dubai, Richard sat in his hotel room, phone in hand. It was 9 o'clock at night in Brazil, the time when, according to Valerie, Ms. Carney did something weird. He opened the app, selected the camera in Brian's room, and what he saw was not what he expected. Ms. Carney entered the room carrying something. Richard zoomed in. It was a rag doll, a handmade doll, sewn with colorful fabrics, with a dress that looked a lot like the one Melissa wore in family photos. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Ms. Connie sat on the rug next to Brian's bed. The boy was awake, looking at her with those empty eyes that Richard knew so well. Eyes that hadn't shown emotion in 2 years. Ms. Connie began to move the doll, to make it dance, to bring it to life. And then she did something that Richard didn't expect. She began to sing. It was an old song, a lullaby that Richard had heard before, but he couldn't remember where. Ms. Connie sang softly, with that raspy, warm voice of grandmothers who've comforted generations of scared children. The doll danced to the rhythm, and Brian watched. Just watched. Nothing extraordinary happened that first night. Ms. Connie sang for 20 minutes, then tucked Brian in, kissed him on the forehead, and left the room. Richard closed the app. Nothing weird, he thought. Just a caring housekeeper doing her job. But something bothered him. The song. He knew that song. The second night, Richard Montgomery checked the security cameras again. Same ritual. Ms. Connie came in at 9 p.m., sat on the floor, took out the doll and sang the same lullaby. But this time Richard noticed something different. Brian wasn't just watching. Brian was moving. His little hands were moving to the rhythm of the song, barely perceptible. But they were moving. Richard zoomed in on the image. He saw his grandson's hands move for the first time in months. It wasn't much, but it was something. The third night, Richard almost forgot to check. He had a dinner with investors. But when he got back to the hotel, drunk and exhausted, something compelled him to open the app. And what he saw froze him to the core. Ms. Connie was sitting on the floor as always. The doll was in her lap. But this time, Brian wasn't in bed. Brian was in Ms. Connie's lap. The boy who wouldn't let anyone touch him. The boy who recoiled from hugs. The boy that therapists described as isolated and unreachable. That boy was nestled in the lap of a housekeeper, his head resting against her chest, while she sang softly in his ear. Richard dropped his phone. He couldn't process what he was seeing. For 2 years, he had paid the best specialists in the world. He had spent fortunes on therapy. He had begged Brian to hug him, to look at him, to give him some sign that he was still in there. And now he was seeing his grandson embracing the woman he had considered firing. The woman who earned $3,000 a month, the woman Valerie had called suspicious. Richard turned off his phone and he poured himself another whiskey, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't sleep. But that wasn't all. What Richard didn't know was that Ms. Connie had a reason for doing what she did. A reason he was about to discover in the most painful way possible. Because Ms. Connie had lost someone too, someone who had also stopped talking, someone she couldn't save. Over the next few days, Richard became obsessed with the recordings. He checked every night on every ritual and every song. He noticed patterns. Miss Connie always arrived around 8:30, prepared dinner for the children. After their bath, she entered Brian's room at precisely 9 o'clock. The ritual lasted between 40 minutes and an hour. Always the same song. Always the doll. But there was something else. On the 10th night of recordings, Richard saw something that made him pause the video. Miss Connie had taken out a notebook. It was an old notebook, with yellowed pages. She placed it in front of Brian and began turning the pages slowly. Richard zoomed in until he could see what was on those pages. Drawings, hand-drawn pictures in crayon, a boy and a woman, a house with flowers, a yellow sun. And below, written in a child's handwriting, words that Richard couldn't make out in the recording. Miss Connie pointed to the drawings, one by one. She spoke in a low voice, so low that the camera didn't pick up the words. But Brian was watching. And this time, he wasn't just watching. Brian picked up a crayon. Richard almost threw his phone. His grandson. His grandson who hadn't shown interest in anything for 2 years. His grandson who the therapists had described as disconnected from the world. That boy was drawing. Wobbly, imperfect, almost invisible lines. But they were lines. It was color. It was something. Richard stared at the screen until 3 in the morning. He saw Miss Connie carefully put the notebook away. He saw Brian fall asleep in her arms. He watched the housekeeper carry him to bed with a gentleness that he, the grandfather, had never managed. And then he understood something terrible. A stranger knew his grandson better than he did. A housekeeper who earned less than the maintenance on one of his cars. A woman he had considered firing. But the story doesn't end here. Because what Richard saw on the 15th night was going to change everything. Absolutely everything. On the 14th night, Richard was sitting in a 5-star restaurant in Dubai, surrounded by millionaire investors, talking about deals worth more than most people earn in their entire lives. But he couldn't concentrate. His mind was 12,000 kilometers away, in a child's bedroom in New York City, watching through a camera what no therapist had achieved. He apologized to the investors, said he had an emergency. He went to the restaurant bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and opened the camera app. It was 9:15 in the evening in Brazil. Miss Connie was already in Brian's room. But tonight was different. Tonight, Miss Connie didn't have the doll. She didn't have the notebook of drawings. She wasn't sitting on the floor. Tonight, Miss Connie was standing by the window, looking out, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. And Brian was standing next to her, looking at her. Richard had never seen his grandson stand next to someone willingly. Never seen Brian approach another person without being forced. But there he was, standing by the window, in his dinosaur pajamas, looking at the housekeeper who was crying silently. And then Brian did something. Something small, something almost imperceptible, something Richard had to zoom in 3 times to confirm he wasn't imagining it. Brian reached out and touched Miss Connie's hand. Just a touch, just a second, just the graze of a 7-year-old's fingers against the hand of a 63-year-old woman. But that touch contained more than all the words Brian hadn't spoken in 2 years. Richard dropped his phone on the bathroom floor. He picked it up with trembling hands. He looked at the screen again. Miss Connie had turned around. She was looking at Brian with an expression Richard knew very well. It was the expression of someone who had just received a gift they didn't expect. A small miracle, a sign that all the effort had been worth it. Miss Connie knelt down in front of Brian. She took his hand gently and began to speak to him softly. The camera didn't pick up the word "ati," but Richard didn't need to hear them. He could read Miss Connie's lips. He could see the way she moved her mouth, and he recognized the words. "It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault, my child. Mommy loved you, and she still loves you, wherever she is." Richard closed his eyes. For 2 years, he had avoided talking about the accident with Brian. He had hired psychologists to do it. He had paid fortunes to therapists specializing in childhood trauma. But he, the grandfather, the man who was supposed to be the pillar of that family, had never had the courage to sit in front of his grandson and say the words he needed to hear. It wasn't your fault. Because to say those words, Richard would have to admit. He repeated them to himself every night. It wasn't my fault. Melissa died and it wasn't my fault. I was working that day. I should have taken the kids to school. I should have been there. It wasn't my fault. But it felt like it was. And maybe that's why he understood Brian. Maybe that's why the boy wouldn't talk. Because when you carry guilt that huge, words become useless. They become insufficient. They become dangerous. Richard left the restroom. He walked to the bar in the restaurant and ordered a whiskey. And while it was being served, he made a decision. He was going back to New York City, not in 2 weeks like he'd planned, not when the negotiations were over. Now, tonight, on the next available flight. But then his cell phone rang. It was Valerie. "Honey, I need you to talk to her." Richard frowned. "To who?" "To the housekeeper. Ms. Connie. Something happened today." Richard's heart stopped. "What happened? Is Brian okay? Is Lily okay?" Yes, they're fine. It's not that. It's just that today when I got home, I found her in Brian's room again, and I asked her what she was doing, and the way she answered me, I didn't like it." Richard closed his eyes. "What did she say?" "She said she was taking care of the boy, that it was her job. And when I asked her why she was spending so much time with him, she said something strange. She said that Brian reminded her of someone, that she couldn't help it." Richard felt a chill. "Someone like who?" "I don't know. She wouldn't tell me. But I don't like it, Richard. I don't like that a housekeeper is getting so attached to the kids. It's not professional. I think we should fire her when you get back." Richard was silent for a long moment. "I'm not going to fire her, Valerie." "But, no, I'm not going to fire her. In fact, I'm coming back tomorrow. I have something I need to do." Valerie was silent. "What do you have to do?" "Something I should have done 2 years ago." Richard hung up the phone. He finished the whiskey in one gulp, and he called his assistant to get him a flight to New York City in the next 6 hours. But before he left the restaurant, he did something else. He opened the security camera app one last time that night. The recording from Brian's room was still running. Ms. Connie and the boy were no longer by the window. They were sitting on the bed, side by side. And Ms. Connie was singing again, the same song as always, but this time. Richard paid attention to the lyrics. He turned the volume on his cell phone all the way up, and he listened. It was a song about a mother going on a trip, a song about a son waiting for her, a song about stars that shine in the night, so that those who love each other never get lost. And then Richard remembered that song. Melissa used to sing it to Brian when he was a baby. She sang it every night before bed. She sang it in the car when they went to school. She sang it on rainy days when Brian was afraid of the thunder. It was Melissa's song, and somehow, in some impossible way, Ms. Connie knew it. Richard dropped his cell phone on the table. His hands were shaking. His heart was beating so hard. He could hear it in his ears. How did she know that song? How did a housekeeper, hired just 8 months ago, know the song that his dead daughter used to sing to her son? It was impossible. Unless Ms. Connie wasn't just a housekeeper. Unless there was something more. Something that no one had told him. Something that was hidden somewhere in this story. Richard grabbed his cell phone tightly. He searched in the app. He went back through the recordings. He went back to the first nights, when he had just installed the cameras. And he started looking. He was looking for clues. He was looking for something that explained the connection between Ms. Connie and Melissa. He was looking for a reason for what he was seeing. And he found it. In the recording from the second day, A recording that he had overlooked because it seemed insignificant. Ms. Connie was cleaning Brian's room. She was wiping down the furniture, organizing the toys, making the bed. All normal, all routine. But at one point, Ms. Connie stopped. She had found something under Brian's bed, a box, an old shoebox, covered in dust that no one had touched in years. Ms. Connie opened the box carefully, and what was inside made her sit on the floor and remain motionless for several minutes. Richard zoomed in on the image. He tried to see what was in the box. Photos, letters, and a CD. A CD with a handwritten label that Richard couldn't read in the recording. Ms. Connie looked at the photos one by one. She put her hand to her chest. She wiped away tears, and then she put everything back in the box, put it exactly where she had found it, and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. But she didn't keep cleaning like before. She continued cleaning while crying silently. Richard paused the video. He knew what was in that box. It was Melissa's memory box, the box that his daughter had kept under Brian's bed because she wanted her son to have access to her memories when he was older. And in that box, among the photos and letters, was a CD. A CD that Melissa had recorded before Brian was born. A CD with lullabies that she was going to sing to her baby, songs that she had chosen from her own childhood, songs that her mother, Brian's grandmother, had sung to her when she was a little girl. Ms. Connie had found that CD. Ms. Connie had listened to those songs, and Ms. Connie had learned to sing them. That explained how she knew Melissa's song. It wasn't magic. It wasn't coincidence. It was dedication. It was love. It was the effort of a woman who had decided to do what no one else had done. Listen to a child who wouldn't talk, understand what he needed, and give it to him without asking for anything in return. If you didn't feel something with this, if it didn't shake you to your bones. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you found the key to helping a child that everyone had given up on? Would you go your way? Would you do your job? Would you collect your paycheck and go home? Or would you do what Ms. Connie did? Give more than you were asked to give. Love more than you were paid to love. Be more than they expected. Richard's flight took off at 3 in the morning Dubai time. 12 hours in the air, 12 hours to think about everything he had seen, 12 hours to prepare for what was coming. Because Richard knew that when he arrived in New York City, he was going to have to do something difficult, something he had been avoiding for 2 years. He was going to have to talk to Brian, not through psychologists, not through therapists, not through specialists with fancy degrees, and directly. Grandfather to grandson, man to boy. Richard was going to have to tell him the words Ms. Connie had whispered by the window. The words he'd never had the courage to say aloud. It wasn't your fault. But he also needed to tell him something else. Something perhaps even more important. I love you, and I'm going to be here. No matter how long it takes you to speak again, no matter if you never say another word, I'm going to be here, always. The plane landed in New York City at 4 in the afternoon. Richard didn't go to the office. He didn't go home first. He didn't call Valerie to tell her he'd arrived. He went directly to talk to Ms. Connie. He found her in the kitchen preparing dinner for the kids. Her back was turned, chopping vegetables, humming that song Richard now knew by heart. Richard stood in the doorway watching her, and in that moment he knew he had misjudged this woman, that he had underestimated her, that he'd been about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Ms. Connie, she turned around and saw Richard, and her expression changed. It wasn't fear, it wasn't surprise, it was something else. It was the look of someone who knows a secret is about to be revealed. Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't expecting you back today. I took an earlier flight. Ms. Connie nodded slowly, put the knife down on the table, wiped her hands on her apron. You need to talk to me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. As if she knew exactly why he was there. Richard entered the kitchen, closed the door behind him. I saw the recordings. Ms. Connie said nothing, just looked at him with those tired eyes that had seen too much in 63 years of life. I saw everything you do with Brian at night. I saw the doll. I saw the notebook. I saw how you hug him. I saw how you sing to him. Ms. Connie lowered her gaze. Sir, I didn't mean to. And I saw how he found the box under his bed. I saw how he discovered the CD with my daughter's songs. The silence in the kitchen was so thick, Richard could feel it pressing against his chest. Ms. Connie looked up. She had tears in her eyes. I didn't know they were hers. Your daughter's. I just saw that the boy had a box with memories of his mother, and I thought that maybe if he heard something familiar, something that reminded him of her, maybe. Her voice broke. Maybe he would come back. Richard felt something break inside him, something that had been frozen for 2 years, something he had kept locked away so he could keep functioning, so he could keep working, so he could keep pretending he was okay. Why, Miss Connie? Why do you do all this? It's not your job. No one pays you for this. Why? Miss Connie remained silent for a long moment, and then she said something Richard never expected to hear. 15 years ago, I lost my grandson. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Miss Connie slumped into a kitchen chair. Her large, strong hands trembled on the table. His name was Kyle. He was 6 years old, the son of my youngest daughter. Richard sat down across from her. He said nothing, just listened. Kyle was a happy child. He smiled all the time, sang songs he made up, danced in the rain. He was pure light. Miss Connie closed her eyes. But one day, his father, my son-in-law, had a work accident. A machine crushed his hand. He lost 3 fingers. He couldn't work anymore. And he started to drink. Richard knew that story. He'd seen it hundreds of times. The pain that destroys families, the trauma that passes from generation to generation. My son-in-law became violent, Miss Connie continued. He beat my daughter. And one day, Kyle saw something that no child should ever see. What did he see? He saw his father beat his mother unconscious. And after that, Kyle stopped talking. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. The doctors said the same thing they said about Brian. Selective mutism, severe trauma, possibly permanent. Richard looked at Ms. Connie with new eyes. He no longer saw an employee. He saw a grandmother who had walked the same road he was walking now. What happened to Kyle? Ms. Connie opened her eyes. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I did everything I could. I took him to doctors, to psychologists, to healers. I spent everything I had. I sold my house. I sold my jewelry. I sold everything. And it worked. He started talking again. No. The word fell like a stone into a deep well. It didn't work. Nothing worked. But not because there was no solution, but because I didn't have time. What do you mean? My son-in-law killed my daughter, and then he killed himself. And Kyle was in the house when it happened. He saw it all. Richard closed his eyes. Kyle died 3 days later. The doctors said it was cardiac arrest, but I know the truth. He died of sadness. He died because he saw too much, because the pain was bigger than his little heart could bear. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Richard couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't process what he was hearing. Miss Connie wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Since that day, I've worked in the homes of wealthy families. I've taken care of many children, and I always look for the same thing. What do you look for? I look for the ones no one sees, the ones who are broken inside, the ones the world has given up on. Because I couldn't save my Kyle, but maybe, just maybe, I can save another one. Richard felt like his heart was going to explode. When I saw Brian for the first time, Ms. Connie continued, I recognized him. He had the same look that Kyle had, the same way of hiding inside himself, the same silence that screams without making a sound. How did you know the music would work? I didn't know. But I remembered something. When Kyle stopped talking, there was only one moment when he seemed to be at peace. It was when I sang to him. He didn't respond, but his eyes changed. They became softer, less afraid. And you thought that maybe. I thought that maybe what didn't work with Kyle could work with Brian. I thought that maybe if I gave him enough time, enough love, enough music, maybe he could find his way back. And you found the box. Yes, I found the box. I saw the pictures of your daughter. I saw the letters she wrote to Brian when he was still in her womb. And I saw the CD with the songs. Miss Connie nodded. I listened to it, and I recognized the songs. They were old songs, lullabies that my grandmother sang to me, that I sang to my daughter, that my daughter sang to Kyle. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Your daughter Melissa and my daughter had something in common, Mr. Montgomery. They both learned those songs from their grandmothers, and they both wanted to pass them on to their children, but neither of them could. No, neither could. My daughter died before Brian could even remember the songs, and his daughter died before Richard could teach them to him himself. Richard got up from his chair. He walked to the kitchen window. He looked out at the garden where Brian and Lily were playing, under the watchful eye of a nanny. So you're telling me that you, a housekeeper who makes $3,000 a month, has done more for my grandson in 8 months than all the specialists I've paid for 2 years? Miss Connie shook her head. I didn't do anything special, Mr. Montgomery. I just gave him what he needed: time, patience, and his mother's songs. Richard turned around. He looked directly into her eyes. That's extraordinary, Miss Connie. That's exactly what the specialists never did. They tried to fix him, to cure him, to force him to talk, but you simply loved him. Miss Connie lowered her gaze. It's the only thing I know how to do, Mr. Montgomery. Richard walked towards her. He knelt in front of her chair. Something a millionaire never does in front of a housekeeper. But Richard no longer saw an employee. He saw an angel, disguised as a woman in a blue uniform. Miss Connie, I need to ask you something. Anything, Mr. Montgomery. I want you to teach me. I want you to teach me how to do what you do. I want to learn the songs. I want to learn how to sit with him. I want to learn to be the grandfather I should have been from the beginning. Miss Connie looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears. Mr. Montgomery, you don't need me to teach you anything. You just need to be present. That's all Brian wants. For you to be there. Richard nodded slowly. Then I'm going to be there from today. From now on. And at that moment, the kitchen door opened. It was Brian. The little boy stood in the doorway, in his dinosaur pajamas, staring at his grandfather kneeling in front of the housekeeper. His eyes darted back and forth between them. And in those eyes, Richard saw something he hadn't seen in 2 years. Curiosity, interest, connection. Bree, Richard said in a trembling voice, come here, sweetie. Brian didn't move, but he didn't leave either. Richard stood up slowly. He walked towards his grandson. He knelt down in front of him to be at his level. Bree, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Brian looked at him with those huge eyes that had seen too much. What happened with Mom wasn't your fault. What you saw in the car wasn't your fault. Nothing that happened was your fault. Brian didn't respond, but his eyes filled with tears. And I also have something to tell you. Something I never told you because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I said it, I would break her. But I'm not afraid anymore. Richard took his grandson's hands in his own. I love you, Bree. I love you more than I can say with words. And I'm going to be here with you and always, no matter how long it takes you to talk again. No matter if you never say another word. I'm going to be here. I'm going to sing you your mum's lullabies. I'm going to sit with you at night. I'm going to do everything that Miss Connie has been doing. Because that's what I should have been doing from the beginning. Brian stared at his grandfather. Tears streamed down his cheeks. And then, he did something. Something small. Something that no one except Richard noticed. He moved his lips. No sound came out, but his lips moved. They formed a word. A single word. Richard felt his heart stop. He looked again. Brian moved his lips again, and this time, Richard could read the word. Grandpa. Richard collapsed. He fell to his knees in front of his grandson and hugged him with a force he didn't know he had. Tears streamed down his face. His body trembled with sobs that had been bottled up for 2 years. Brian didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. But for the first time in 742 days, he hugged back. His little arms wrapped around his grandfather's neck. His head rested on Richard's shoulder, and they stayed like that, on the kitchen floor, while Miss Connie watched them with tears in her eyes. Some people are going to pause the video here. Some people are going to think that this is a made-up story, that no one does this, that housekeepers aren't angels, that miracles don't exist. But I'm going to ask you something. If miracles don't exist, how do you explain a 63-year-old woman who lost her grandson 15 years ago and decided to spend the rest of her life saving other children? If miracles don't exist, how do you explain a 7-year-old boy who hadn't hugged anyone in 2 years and suddenly hugs his grandfather? If miracles don't exist, how do you explain the songs of a dead mother, sung by a stranger, that accomplished what the best doctors in the world couldn't? I'm going to tell you what miracles are. Miracles are people who choose to love when it would be easier not to. Miracles are hands that heal Sue without having diplomas. Miracles are lullabies sung at 9 o'clock at night by someone who has no obligation to sing them. But the story doesn't end here, because what happened in the following weeks was something that no one expected. Not Richard, not Miss Connie, not even Brian. Richard kept his promise. He reduced his travel from 70% to 30%. He delegated more responsibilities to his managers. He started coming home at 6 in the evening instead of 10 at night, and every night at 9 o'clock. He went into Brian's room, but he didn't go in alone. He went in with Miss Connie. The first few days, Richard simply sat in a corner and observed. He watched Miss Connie take out the doll, how she sang the songs, how she got Brian to draw in the notebook. But little by little, Richard started to participate. He learned Melissa's song. At first, his voice was clumsy, off-key, embarrassed. But Miss Connie didn't make fun of him. She simply corrected his notes with patience, taught him the words he forgot, showed him how to make the doll dance, and Brian watched everything. His eyes went from his grandfather to Miss Connie, from Richard's clumsy voice to the housekeeper's warm voice. And something changed in those eyes, something subtle, but undeniable. Brian's eyes began to sparkle. Not much, not all the time, but every now and then. When Richard sang a particularly off-key note, a flash of something seemed to cross those dark eyes. Miss Connie was the first to notice it. "Mr. Montgomery, look!" Richard stopped singing. "What?" "Look at Brian's eyes. Look what just happened." Richard looked, and he saw it. Brian was looking directly at his grandfather, not through him, like he used to do. Not into the void, directly at him. And in those eyes, there was something that Richard hadn't seen in 2 years. Fun. Her grandson was amused by just how badly he sang. Richard didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So he did both. "I know I sing horribly, Brian. Your mom always told me I sounded like a cat being run over. Brian didn't respond, but his lips curved upward, just a millimeter, just for a second, but it was a smile. Brian's first smile in 772 days. Richard covered his mouth with his hand. Tears streamed down his face again. Miss Connie was smiling too, with that tired, wise smile of grandmothers who have seen too much, and yet still believe in miracles. But there was someone who wasn't smiling. Valerie. Richard's wife had been observing the changes in the house with a mix of confusion and irritation. She didn't understand why her husband suddenly spent more time with the kids than with her. She didn't understand why the housekeeper she had wanted to fire was now treated like part of the family. And she definitely didn't understand why Richard went into Brian's room every night to sing lullabies. One night, Valerie confronted Richard. They were in their bedroom. Richard had just returned from Brian's room. His eyes were red from crying tears of happiness. "Richard, we need to talk." "What's wrong?" "What's wrong is I don't recognize you anymore. You've been acting strange for weeks. You cancelled million-dollar deals to stay home. You treat the housekeeper like she's family. And you spend more time with the mute child than with me." Richard felt something icy run down his spine. "His name is Brian. He's my grandson. And he's not mute. He's just not ready to talk." Valerie crossed her arms. "Whatever. The point is, this can't go on. Either you go back to being the man I married, or we're going to have problems." Richard looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised even himself. "The man you married was a coward, Valerie. He was a man who ran from his pain by working 20 hours a day. He was a man who let a housekeeper do what he should have been doing. I don't want to be that man anymore." Valerie opened her mouth to respond, but Richard interrupted her. "And if that means we're going to have problems, then we're going to have problems. But I'm not going to abandon my grandchildren again. I'm not going to let someone else do my job again. And if you don't like it, the door is where it's always been." Valerie didn't say anything. She just looked at him with cold eyes and left the room. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat on the living room couch, looking out at the dark garden, thinking about everything that had happened, thinking about Melissa, thinking about Brian, thinking about Miss Connie, and thinking about the decision he had just made. Because Richard knew that his marriage was probably over. He knew that Valerie wasn't going to understand. He knew that the life he had built after Melissa's death was about to fall apart. But he also knew that he didn't care, because for the first time in 2 years, he was being the man he was supposed to be. For the first time, he was being a real grandfather. And that was worth more than any contract, more than any marriage, more than anything money could buy. The following days were intense. Valerie went to her mother's house, saying she needed time to think. Richard didn't try to stop her. He just nodded and wished her a safe trip. Ms. Connie continued to come every morning. She continued cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children. But now her relationship with Richard was different. It was no longer the relationship between employer and employee. It was something more akin to the relationship between two people who share a mission. And Brian kept improving. Small progress and almost imperceptible, but constant. He moved his lips more often. He smiled occasionally. He made eye contact for longer periods. And one day, something extraordinary happened. Richard was sitting in Brian's room, singing Melissa's song for the 3rd time that night. Miss Connie was beside him, correcting his notes when he made mistakes. And Brian was lying in bed, with his eyes closed, listening. Suddenly, without any warning, without any prior sign, Brian opened his eyes. He looked directly at his grandfather, and he opened his mouth. What came out wasn't a word. It wasn't a phrase. It was something more primitive, more basic, more profound. It was a sound, a raspy, barely audible sound, that seemed to have been saved for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "Ah," Richard stopped singing. Ms. Connie put her hand to her chest, and Brian did it again. Ah. It was the same sound he made when he was a baby, the same sound he made before the accident, when he tried to sing the songs his mother sang to him, the same sound Richard had thought he would never hear again. And at that moment, Richard understood something. Brian wasn't trying to talk. He was trying to sing. The following weeks were a whirlwind of small miracles. Each night, Brian did a little more. A new sound, a different syllable, an attempt at a melody. They weren't words, they weren't complete songs, but they were sounds. They were attempts. They were signs that something was changing inside that child that everyone had given up on. Ms. Connie called a therapist specializing in music therapy, a gray-haired woman named Dr. Helen, who had worked with traumatized children for 30 years. Dr. Helen came to the house one Tuesday morning. She observed Brian for 2 hours. She watched him draw. She watched him interact with Ms. Connie. She watched him move to the rhythm of Melissa's song. And at the end of the session, she told Richard something that changed his life. "Mr. Montgomery, your grandson doesn't have selective mutism." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Brian can talk. He could always talk. But his brain created a blockage as a defense mechanism. And now, thanks to what this woman has been doing, that blockage is starting to dissolve." Richard looked at Ms. Connie. Ms. Connie was looking at the floor. "What she did with the music," continued Dr. Helen, "is exactly what I would have recommended. Music accesses parts of the brain that normal speech can't reach. It's like finding a back door to language." "So he's going to talk?" Dr. Helen smiled. "I can't promise that. But what I can tell you is that Brian is making progress that I haven't seen in 30 years of practice. Normally, when a child with this type of trauma starts to improve, they do it slowly, millimeter by millimeter. But Brian is skipping stages." Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes. Why? Why was Brian skipping stages? Dr. Helen looked at Ms. Connie. "Because someone gave him exactly what he needed. Not clinical therapy, not medication, not techniques learned in books. She gave him unconditional love. She gave him his mother's lullaby. She gave him time to heal, at his own pace." Dr. Helen stood up. She packed her things into a leather briefcase. "Mr. Montgomery, I want you to understand something. There are millions of traumatized children in the world, and there are thousands of therapists trying to help them. But what this woman did for your grandson, it's not taught in any university. It's not in any textbook. It's something that comes from a deeper place. Where does it come from?" Dr. Helen looked at Ms. Connie with respect. "From love. From one's own pain transformed into compassion. From the experience of having lost and deciding that others shouldn't lose the same." Ms. Connie was still looking at the floor, but Richard noticed her shoulders were shaking, that tears were running silently down her cheeks. Richard walked toward her. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Connie. Thank you for saving my grandson." Ms. Connie looked up. Her red eyes met Richard's. "I didn't save him, sir. You saved him. You saved him by coming back from Dubai. You saved him by sitting with him every night. You saved him by singing, even if you sing terribly." Richard chuckled through his tears. "I sing as badly as that? Worse. But Brian doesn't care, because you're there, and that's the only thing that matters." That night, something shifted. Richard walked into Brian's room like he did every night. Miss Connie was beside him with the stuffed animal in her hands, ready to begin their ritual. But before they could start, Brian did something unexpected. He got out of bed. He walked towards Miss Connie. He held out his arms, and he hugged her. Miss Connie froze. Never, in 8 months of working together, had Brian initiated a hug. It was always her who reached out. It was always her who opened her arms. But this time it was different. This time, Brian was hugging the woman who had saved him. And as he hugged her, he opened his mouth and he said something. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a syllable. It was a complete word. A word that no one had heard come out of that mouth in over 700 days. Connie. Richard felt like the world stopped. Miss Connie felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces and rebuild itself at the same time. Brian had spoken, and the first word he said after 2 years of silence was the name of the woman who had brought him back. Connie. Miss Connie fell to her knees and hugged the boy tightly. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Her body trembled with silent sobs. My boy, my precious boy, you did it. You did it. Richard was crying too, but he didn't move. He didn't want to interrupt the moment because he understood that this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to Miss Connie. It belonged to a woman who had lost her grandson 15 years ago and had spent the rest of her life trying to save other children. It belonged to someone who had done the impossible without asking for anything in return. Brian pulled away from the hug. He looked at Miss Connie, and then he looked at his grandfather, and he said another word. Grandpa. Richard felt like his legs could no longer hold him up. He dropped to his knees beside them. He joined the hug, and the three of them stayed there on the floor of the nursery, crying and laughing at the same time. That night, no one slept much. Richard and Miss Connie stayed up talking until 3 in the morning, planning the future, discussing the next steps, celebrating the miracle they had witnessed. And Brian, for the first time in 2 years, slept with a smile on his face. This story should have ended there. It should have been a perfect happy ending. But life doesn't work that way. Life has layers. It has complications. It has twists that no one expects. 2 weeks after Brian said his first word, Valerie came back. She arrived at the house unannounced, with suitcases, with lawyers, and with a court order. Richard, you're losing control of everything. I can't allow you to continue like this. Richard looked at her, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? I spoke with my lawyers. I consulted with psychiatrists, and they all agree that what's happening in this house isn't normal. A man who abandons his career to stay at home singing lullabies. An employee who has total access to the children. This isn't right. Richard felt his blood boil. Brian spoke, Valerie. For the first time in 2 years, he said a word. And you want to tell me that what I'm doing isn't right? Valerie crossed her arms. What they told me is that you're having an episode, that your daughter's death finally affected your head, and that you need professional help. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. Professional help? Valerie. Professional help didn't work. I spent almost $1 million on specialists, and none of them achieved what Ms. Connie achieved in 8 months. Valerie took a step forward. Her expression was cold, calculating. Look, Richard, I'm going to give you 2 options. You fire that employee and go back to working as you used to, or I file a lawsuit for mental incompetence. I have 3 psychiatrists willing to testify. Richard looked at her in silence for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was a bitter laugh, a laugh full of pain and disappointment, a laugh of someone who finally understands who they married. You're threatening to have me declared insane because I'm being a good grandfather. I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you options, Richard shook his head. No, Valerie. They aren't options. It's a test. And you just failed. What do you mean? Richard walked towards the door. You say he opened it. I mean that this marriage is over from this moment. And if you want to try to have me declared insane, go ahead. But I'll warn you something. I have recordings of everything that happened in this house. I have the cameras I installed to watch Miss Connie, and those recordings show exactly what this woman did for my grandson. Richard took a step towards her. And they also show what you didn't do. They show how you ignored Brian, how you avoided Lily, how you treated Ms. Connie as if she were less than human. So if you want to go to court, let's go to court. But I assure you, The only one who's going to win that trial is me. Valerie paled. You can't do that. I already did. My lawyers are preparing everything. And one more thing, Valerie. I want you to leave this house. Today. Now. Valerie said nothing. She just looked at him with pure hatred. And then she left. The divorce took 6 months. It was complicated, expensive, and exhausting. But Richard Montgomery didn't give an inch. He fought for the custody of the children. He fought to keep Ms. Connie in their lives. He fought for everything that mattered, and he won. Valerie left with a share of the dollars, but with no rights to Brian or Lily. The judge who reviewed the camera recordings was so impressed that he cited Ms. Connie as a star witness. And Ms. Connie, in court, before the judge, told her story. She spoke about Kayo, about the loss, about her decision to dedicate her life to helping children that no one else would. The judge listened in silence, and when she finished, he did something unusual. He stood up, stepped down from the bench, walked over to Ms. Connie, and shook her hand. Miss Silver, the judge said, in 40 years on the bench, I've seen thousands of people pass through this courtroom. I've seen the worst aspects of human nature, the greed, the selfishness, the cruelty. But I've also seen the best. And what you did for that little boy is among the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed. Miss Connie lowered her gaze. I just did what anyone would do. Your Honor. No, Miss Silver. That's not what anyone would do. It's what you did. And that makes all the difference. The trial ended. Richard Montgomery won everything. And life went on. 6 months had passed since that day, when Brian spoke his first word. Today, Brian is 8 years old. He speaks. Not much. Not like other children his age. But he speaks. He says good morning. He says good night. He says I love you. And above all, and he sings. He sings his mother's lullaby. He sings it every night before he goes to sleep. He sings it with Richard Montgomery. He sings it with Ms. Connie. He sings it with Lily. It's a song about a mother who went on a journey, about a son who waits for her, about stars that shine, so that those who love each other are never lost. And every time Brian sings that lullaby, Richard Montgomery feels that Melissa is there, somewhere, listening, smiling. Ms. Connie is no longer just an employee. Well, technically, she still is. But no one in the house treats her that way. She has her own room, on the 2nd floor, next to the children's rooms. Richard Montgomery insisted on giving her a raise, but Ms. Connie refused. I don't want more dollars, sir. I want what I have. I want to be here. I want to see Brian grow up. I want to sing with him every night until he doesn't need me anymore. Richard Montgomery tried to argue, but Ms. Connie was adamant. So, they reached an agreement. Ms. Connie would have a room in the house. She would have health insurance. Her position would be guaranteed for as long as she wanted to stay. And when she retired, Richard Montgomery would pay her a pension that would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Ms. Connie accepted, but not for the money. She accepted because, for the first time in 15 years, she felt that her life had a purpose. She accepted because, in some way, Brian had saved her, just as much as she had saved him. And Richard Montgomery. Richard Montgomery stopped being the man he used to be. He stopped working 70 hours a week. He delegated more. He trusted more. He spent more time at home. And he discovered something he didn't know existed. He discovered that being a grandfather was better than being a millionaire. He discovered that singing lullabies, even though he sang horribly, was better than closing million-dollar deals. He discovered that love cannot be bought. It cannot be sold. It cannot be negotiated. Love is simply given, without expecting anything in return. exactly as Ms. Connie had done from the beginning. This is the story of a millionaire who installed cameras to watch his employee. But it's not the story you expected. It's not a story of theft discovered, of an employee fired, of justice served. It's a story of love found, where no one was looking for it. It's a story of miracles performed by hands with calluses and blue uniforms. It's a story of a boy who stopped speaking and a woman who gave him back his voice. It's a story that shouldn't exist, but it does. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to every word, if you felt something in your chest as I told it, then I want you to do something. I want you to think about the invisible people in your life, those who clean your house, those who take care of your children, those who prepare your food, those who work in silence while you live your life. I want you to think about what they do when no one is watching them. And I want you to ask yourself something. How many Miss Connies are there in the world? How many 63-year-old women with blue uniforms and tired hands are performing miracles right now without anyone knowing? The answer is more than you can imagine. And maybe, just maybe, there's one near you right now. Maybe she works in your house. Maybe she works at your children's school. Maybe she works in the hospital where someone you love was healed. And maybe, if you look carefully, if you pay attention to what they do when they think no one is watching, you'll discover that miracles don't come from heaven. Miracles wear cleaning lady uniforms. This story has ended, but yours is just beginning. You have two choices now. Forget what you heard and go on with your life, or remember that small gestures of love are the only things that truly matter. Which of the two will you choose? The answer is in your hands, exactly where it always was.